The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Stephen Hill on labor standards in the remote working world, Jason Stanford on the myths and realities of the Texas origin story, plus Bill Press with Tim Mak on his new book, Misfire, Inside the Downfall of the NRA. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The pandemic is transforming the way we work. Stephen Hill says the shift to remote work can come at a cost to workers unless new protections are put in place. And we say hello to Stephen Hill, political writer and author of 7 books, including the international bestseller, Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. Stephen Hill, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back.
And our pleasure to have you with us, of course. You recently wrote what is a very alarming piece at Project Syndicate on what is happening to workers during the pandemic. And you titled the piece, The Rise of the Distributarian. This is a new word for many of us. What is distributed work?
Well, the term distributarian is kind of a slamming together. You know, the Germans like to smash words together. So I smashed together a word about proletariat with distributed workers. And what distributed workers are, they're workers who work for what's called distributed companies, companies that hire these enormous remote and freelance workforces. So, you know, companies like Upwork, where they have, you know, maybe a few hundred regular employees, and those regular employees use technology to oversee, according to their figures, 10 million freelancers all over the world who hire themselves out to different agencies or individuals. And so this is a distributed workforce because these are workers who don't know each other, can't find each other if they wanted to. They don't work in the same physical location, so they don't get to know each other. It's hard for them to have personal relationships with each other, or to, let alone form a union or have any sense of solidarity with each other. So this is more and more is what's becoming known as a distributed workforce. And so I call these workers the distributariat.
And the piece you wrote identifies some of the challenges facing distributed workers in terms of pay and benefits. How are these workers likely to compare to regular employees?
Well, there's a few things about that. And one thing I should mention is that the prior to the pandemic, there was about, fewer than 4% of U.S. workers were regularly working from home. During the pandemic, the numbers were anywhere from a third to over 60% of workers. And post-pandemic, 74% of companies are planning to shift some employees to remote work permanently. So this is becoming more and more how we work. And this should be a cause of concern for people, not only workers, but for policymakers, because when you look at the difference between how these workers are treated and regular employees working in the workplace, it's really quite alarming. For many of these workers, they don't have any sense of a workplace. They're just isolated individuals. And also, especially if they're freelancers or contractors, they often don't have any health care or any kind of contribution from the employer into their safety net. So they don't have things like health care, injured worker, or unemployment compensation. They're really out there on their own working as kind of lone wolves. And on top of that, the employers, in order to ensure productivity, are increasingly using various surveillance techniques there to keep track of their remote workers, and they don't necessarily even tell the remote workers that they're being surveilled. So there's all sorts of changes that are coming as a result of these new types of working conditions. And it also makes it extremely difficult for labor unions to organize this distributed workforce.
You identified another downside, and you mentioned it briefly a moment ago, and that it's harder to organize a distributed workforce. Why is that the case?
Well, simply because these workers aren't in the same physical location. And so, when you're not in the same physical location, it's hard to form relationships with your coworkers. And in fact, you don't even in many cases know who your coworkers are. So the idea of a labor hall, a union hall, or, union meetings and these sorts of things, it becomes virtually impossible when these workers can't even find each other, because it's the employer that knows who all these individuals are and knows how to contact them. And the employer is not necessarily putting these workers in contact with each other. In some cases, these workers will work together in teams online, but again, they don't really get to know each other very well. Some groups of employees have tried creating things like Facebook groups and others so they can get to interact with each other online. And that certainly is a positive, but it's not the same as being in the physical workplace with each other, where you get to know each other afterwards. You go out and have a beer or have a coffee or whatever. And these are sorts of things that are in some cases disappearing.
Yeah. And, another trend you identified and you mentioned again a moment ago, the increased employer surveillance of at-home workers. So what are the various forms that this can take?
Well, it's really, in some ways, it's extremely impressive as it is alarming. There are a number of new companies and new technologies that are coming online that use different technologies. And so one recent study found that 78% of employers currently use some sort of employee monitoring software. So you have companies like Hubstaff, whose product tracks a worker's mouse movements, keyboard strokes, browsing history, email, file transfers. Virtually anything you're doing on that laptop is being tracked. But when companies start using software like Hubstaff, there's others like T-Sheets, which allows employers to track workers' location. Time Doctor, you got to love the names of some of these software products. Time Doctor records an employee's screen and uses your own webcam to take a picture of you every 10 minutes. And basically what they're trying to do is cut down on what they call cyber slacking, people working at home and who aren't doing the job as the employer wants them to be doing it. And so, this raises a lot of civil liberties issues. This is not just, them tracking you when you're working, say if you normally work in a workplace and you have to go on the road for your job. This is them tracking you in your home. So, and that further leads to other things such as a decline in the work-life balance, because suddenly you're at home, you're working, you're being tracked by your employer, you're increasingly worried that you might lose your job if you aren't performing well, you're getting paranoid, so you work all the time. And there's never really a downtime anymore for people who are at home. And so this evaporation of the work-life balance is another impact that we really have to start wondering about.
We're speaking to Stephen Hill, political writer and author of 7 books, including the international bestseller Raw Deal, How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. The employers, are there other ways they would use this data? Obviously, you're making sure that your employees are doing their jobs, but that sounds awfully invasive. Are there other underlying things that they're using this data for?
Well, we don't really know, because, this is kind of employers have always tracked employees a little bit, time clocks in the workplace and things like this. But this is reaching a new level of Big Brother. And there's really the laws that sort of govern this haven't caught up to the reality of what the technology is capable of and what employers are increasingly using it for. So, they could use the data in other ways if they wanted to. They could use it in a coercive way to get you to work more. They could use it in a way that if you wanted to leave your job and go to a competitor, they could use the data they have in ways to impact your career. I mean, there's just really no limits about what they can do. The only limit is that, an employer who really abuses the power that they have might gain a reputation as a terrible employer. And so maybe it'll be harder to attract good workers. But that seems like a fairly impotent, way to rein in some of these abuses. Really, there needs to be some new guardrails around these new technologies and how they're being used in the employer-employee relationship.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you point out, the potential for significant labor cost reductions is a powerful incentive to shift toward more distributed workforces. So should we expect to see the trend continue even after the pandemic is behind us?
That's what, they do a lot of surveys of employers and ask them, what do you see coming for you a year from now, 2 years, 3 years from now? And one of the recent studies found that 78% of employers are currently using employee monitoring software and plan to continue to use it, and also are going to continue to use ever larger remote workforces. And so if your remote workforce is expanding, then the incentives to be able to track what those workers are doing in their homes is only going to increase.
So then the questions become, what can be done to protect the distributed workers? What kind of guardrails and rules can be put in place to avoid these kinds of worst outcomes?
Well, there's a number of things that we can do. And basically they come down to, we already have a whole bunch of labor laws in the brick and mortar world, so to speak. And there's no reason why we shouldn't apply those laws to the online world. Silicon Valley likes to say, oh, we're technology, we're software, we're different. You can't apply those old 21st century laws to us. And that's just ridiculous. Increasingly, the solution is to apply current laws to all of to the employers, no matter how they are hiring workers. But in addition, we need to have new laws around things like surveillance of your employees when they're working remotely, and whether they can turn off the clock, so to speak, or whether they have to be on 24/7 call, which is how many of the employers are rigging their relationship with the employee. There also needs to be things. So one of the reasons why an employer would go to an increasingly remote workforce is, the estimates have been that they save, for every employee that's working remotely, they save about $11,000 per year. But in addition, once you have workers working remotely, then it becomes much easier to convert that worker into, instead of a regular W-2 wage earning employee, into a 1099 freelancer contractor. And by doing that, employers no longer have to pay for that employee's health care, Social Security, Medicare, injured worker, unemployment compensation. You're basically just out there on your own as a freelancer getting a salary, and that's it. And by doing that, employers save another 25 to 30% of their labor costs by not having to pay for Social Security, their half of Social Security, Medicare, healthcare, these sorts of things. So the one of the things we need to do is create what's known as a portable safety net, where no matter how that worker works, whether they're remote or they're in a workplace, or whether they're a freelancer or a regular W-2 employee, any business, any employer that hires that worker contributes into what I call an individual security account for that worker. They contribute an amount that's prorated to the number of hours that worker works for that business. So if a worker works, say, 10 hours out of a 40-hour work week, they would contribute 25% of that worker's contributions needed for their safety net. And with that money in the individual security account, the worker then would be able to purchase and make their own contributions into Social Security, Medicare, injured worker, unemployment compensation, maybe even have some money for a few sick days and for paid vacation, which so many freelancers and contractors do not have. And so this portable safety net idea is really the most important response to an increasingly remote and increasingly freelance workforce, is to ensure that these workers are covered and that the flexibility that they value as being part of a remote workforce and being part of a contractor or freelance workforce, that flexibility doesn't come at the cost of their security as a worker. And so this is going to be the real challenge going forward, is applying the existing labor laws and then having new laws around things like surveillance, and then also a portable safety net so that these workers have both the flexibility and the security they need.
And obviously, Stephen, as you well know, businesses are not going to do something like this out of the goodness of their heart. In fact, they would probably try and avoid it at all costs. So where will the pressure come from to put these kinds of guardrails and safety nets in place?
The pressure will have to come from labor unions, for one. Labor unions are still powerful in the United States, and they're even more powerful in other countries. They can exert this kind of influence on the workforces that they cover under their union contracts, but also by being part of an effort to help publicize and educate the public about these workplace changes, future of work changes. And so, but it's also going to come from grassroots organizations. There are different ones that are now, they're not labor unions per se, but they are labor advocates. They just need to understand what it is they need to ask for. And so things like portable safety nets is still a somewhat new idea, though President Barack Obama in his 2016 the State of the Union address did call for a portable safety net for all workers. And Senator Mark Warner has held hearings on it. It has actually been part of labor discussions between Uber and labor unions. Most recently, Uber, in its own defective way, has actually started promoting the idea of a portable safety net. And recently in California, where they passed a Proposition 22 to undermine some of the labor laws in California, they actually included as an incentive for voters to vote for a portable safety net. The problem is that the portable safety net is completely underfunded and doesn't do nearly the amount of things it needs to do for those Uber drivers. So increasingly, there is interest in this, even in the private sector. It's just a matter of bringing them to the table so that they actually create a portable safety net that is going to be helpful for workers instead of destructive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure we've got a long way to go on this one. Stephen Hill, political writer, author of 7 books, including the international bestseller Raw Deal, How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Stephen, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. Look forward to doing it again soon.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what history books get wrong about the Alamo and why that matters. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
America's economic and political inequality has led workaday Americans to exclaim, "The system is broken. Let's fix it." But there's another version of this protest that I'm hearing more frequently these days. The system is fixed. Let's break it. That certainly applies to such rigged systems as money in politics and voter suppression, but it's also relevant to seemingly mundane matters that restrain our personal freedoms. One of the insidious fixes we need to break is the claim by brand-name corporations that we consumers must be banned by law from repairing the products they sell to us. The weak battery in your cell phone, the fuel sensor in a farmer's tractor, some gizmo in the toaster you bought, a fuse in your business's truck. You could fix all of these yourself or, with a little hassle, take the problem to a local repair shop. But no, such manufacturing powerhouses as Apple, John Deere, and Panasonic assert that only their corporate technicians are authorized to open the product, which you own, to make it work again. So you are expected to deliver it to their distant facility, wait however many days or weeks they tell you, and pay an inflated price. They've literally fixed the fix for consumer products. They impose their control by making the products as needlessly complicated as possible, then claiming that the complexity is their patented proprietary product. Thus, they say they don't have to provide repair manuals or sell repair tools to consumers or independent shops. Gotcha. To give their closed profiteering system the force of law, the giants have deployed armies of lobbyists and lawyers to legislatures and courts, arguing that self-repair people really are scoundrels trying to circumvent safety and environmental rules. This is Jim Hightower saying, for action, go to U.S. Public Interest Research Group, uspurg.org. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by our new Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe, with kick-ass political spark plugs like Beto O'Rourke, musical champions like Marcia Ball, and grassroots change makers like the New Georgia Project and People's Action. The Lowdown Happy Hour is reaching out to you to help put the move in movement. So grab a libation and join the fun. Details at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Almost 200 years after the Battle of the Alamo, a new book aims to correct the historical record. Co-author Jason Stanford explains how the myth of the Alamo continues to be used to advance political agendas and encourage racism. And we say hello to Jason Stanford, an Austin-based writer and the co-author with Brian Burrow and Chris Tomlinson of Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth. Jason Stanford, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Jim. It's a pleasure.
And certainly the pleasure is ours. Now, you've written a book here that is causing quite a controversy. We'll get to that. But first, let's talk about the book itself. Your thesis is that we've been telling the Alamo story all wrong. In what ways is that the case?
Oh, almost every way, except the fact that it happened in San Antonio. The myth of the Alamo is pretty clear. It's been handed down since John Wayne made the movie and Walt Disney made the Davy Crockett TV shows. The myth is basically that a bunch of freedom-loving Americans came to Texas and they fought tyranny in the form of the evil and dastardly Santa Anna. And they holed up in the Alamo knowing that they were going to die. But they willingly gave their lives in battle to buy Sam Houston time to raise an army so that he could win freedom for Texas. There are only a few problems with that. The main one is that almost none of that is true.
So what is the more truthful way to tell this story?
Well, the more truthful way is that Santa Anna had a problem with Texas, and namely that it was overrun with Comanches. The Comanche raids would come down and take whatever they wanted, and he had a hard time convincing Mexicans to live in Texas, which at that time was a frontier state way up north and a long ways from Mexico City. At the same time, cotton was booming, and in the South, land was cotton land was kind of expensive, and they kept looking at the cotton fertile, the land that would be good for farming cotton in Texas, and you had a whole bunch of white farmers who wanted to move into Texas and farm cotton. And sooner or later, Santa Anna did that because he basically invited in Anglo settlers as a buffer against the Comanche. The problem with that was right off the bat. Back then, to farm cotton, you had to enslave the workforce. That's how the business model was set up. And it's no secret to anyone. But Mexico was an abolitionist country. When they won their freedom from Spain, they wrote into the Constitution that slavery was illegal. They made a concession with Texas and the settlers to allow slavery for a little while. Eventually, there were so many Texans in there that they worried that they were going to lose Texas to the United States, and so they decided to cut off immigration. One of the great ironies of our book is we found out that the first time immigration was illegal in Texas is they're trying to keep white people out. In any case, eventually they made slavery illegal. They said, no, really, we're going to enforce it. And then they actually did start to enforce it. And that caused a lot of the conflicts, which are told in Texas as a fight for federalism, that they wanted to run Texas according to Texas rules, and they didn't want Mexico City to tell them what to do. What Mexico City was essentially telling them to do was actually follow the laws, one of which was no slaves. And that was one of the biggest and most obvious causes of the Texas Revolution that never gets taught in Texas schools.
Your book, to a great extent, Jason, is how the myth of the Alamo has been able to endure and the impact of that. So what are some of the ways in which the myth is still being upheld?
Well, the first one is the way it was one of the myths was created right away. Sam Houston knew that this big military disaster had to be turned into something that would motivate his side. It got turned into a revenge myth right away. That all these people were slaughtered and we had to avenge them, which is how we get the phrase, remember the Alamo. That was first yelled at the Battle of San Jacinto to try to motivate the Texians, who, as they were called back then, to overrun the Mexicans. So that endures to this day. The Alamo has been used as a symbol for needing to exact military revenge to this day. LBJ, one of my favorite parts of the book was finding out that he used it to try to get people to encourage the United States to get into World War II, to try to keep them out of the first Indochina War. And then most obviously, all the direct comparisons he made with Vietnam, saying Vietnam is just like the Alamo, which seems like a really weird thing to say when you're trying to get people to go there.
Yeah.
Lately,
absolutely.
though, after 9/11, we had members of Congress stand up and call Saddam Hussein a 21st century Santa Anna, and saying that is exactly why they used the Alamo to justify the troop surge in 2006. And we talked to one of the curators of the Alamo, and troops would come back. San Antonio is a big military city, and they'd cycle back in after fighting abroad in our wars, and they'd show pictures of their little forward bases in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he said, yeah, there's only one Alamo in San Antonio, but there are hundreds of them in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Alamo is part of the story we tell when we try to say we have to go fight brown-skinned people somewhere else.
We're speaking to Jason Stanford, an Austin-based writer and the co-author with Brian Burrow and Chris Tomlinson of Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth. Jason, what has been the impact of this misunderstanding? How has the heroic Anglo narrative of Texas history played out in our political lives?
Jim, that's a great question. One of the great surprises of the book was finding out the answer to that question. We thought we were just writing a myth-busting book. We thought, go in, it'd be basically a book-length essay about how there never was a line in the sand, and Davy Crockett surrendered, and he didn't go down swinging. Not that there's any loss of honor in that. And then I remember we interviewed Andres Tijerina, the godfather of Mexican-American history. And we asked him we were talking to him about history. We want to talk about revisionism. And he ended up telling us about him taking 7th grade Texas history and about how the teacher, he was in West Texas because he is the son of migrant workers. And they made him stand up, and it was otherwise an all-white classroom. And the teacher pointed at him and said, there's Andy. it could have been his grandparents who killed Davy Crockett. And we heard about field trips where friends would walk in as Texans and they'd come out as Mexicans and Texans. And I have a friend, and he grew up in San Antonio. And after school, his friends played Alamo. And it was all the white kids on one side and all the brown kids on the other, except when they played it, the white kids won. So the big effect this has on Texas, the Alamo myth, is to separate the brown kids from the white kids and to tell the brown kids that they are bad and that people who look like them were evil and that they are the losers in their own home state.
Wow.
That was so pervasive. The entire book could have been taken up with those anecdotes. A couple of things happen when you're told that, if you're a Hispanic Texan. One is you get real pissed off, like Andres Tiarina, and you devote your career to try and setting the record straight. Not about the Alamo, because the Alamo became white people's history. That's just something white people tell about themselves. But we, the Hispanic Texans, I'm not Hispanic, but Hispanic Texans would tell each other at home this, the truth. And so they would grow up in a world that would they'd go to school and be told that they were wrong and evil. And they'd see all this popular culture. I mean, everything in Texas is named after someone from the Texas Revolution. My kid went to Austin High School. Stephen F. Austin is involved in the Texas Revolution. There's a Bowie High School for Jim Bowie. There's a Travis High School in Austin here. There's a Crockett High School. Everything is named after the Alamo here, and after the Texas Revolution in Texas. So you're in this world that says this Texas Revolution was this great, glorious creation myth in which the white kids essentially get to play real macho Jesus, right? The self-sacrifice so that others may live. It's this glorious tale of what a Texan is like, except if you're Hispanic, then it's just crazy making, because you're told all the time in popular culture and in school and by the politicians that you're wrong and you're evil. And then you go home and your dad says, no, all of that's BS. Here's the real truth. And so there's this huge dissonance. And so you just disengage with it. And there's so many Hispanic Texans who just treat it like white people's history. Let me give you an example. The state senator who currently represents the Alamo, the downtown San Antonio, when he first got elected, he rented a tour bus and got a bunch of community leaders from his Senate district and took them all around the Senate district and said, okay, here's this district. As you can imagine, it's downtown San Antonio. These are mostly Hispanic community leaders. It was the first time most of them had ever been to the Alamo. It's not like being in LA and not going to Disneyland. It becomes like this other thing that you keep yourself from, because it's a story about how essentially people with your color skin are evil and how they're bad and how white people had to, beat you to win freedom.
Yeah, I mean, why would you want to go? Right.
It's a really, excuse the language, it's a really crappy historical site. The average visitor spends 10 minutes there. There's just not much there because for so long it's been sanitized, and it was managed for more than 100 years by a lineage organization called the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. There is no genetic code to being able to correctly manage a historical site. It just fell into disrepair. They're mostly worried about the gift shop the whole time, which by far is the most interesting part about that exhibit. They would force you to take off your hat as you walk through the chapel. They would, you had to lower your voice and whisper in there and show reverence, because this is basically this is our Western Wall. This is a secular shrine, and it's considered a holy site by many, many white Texans.
Mm. Well, and as we mentioned before, the book is causing controversy. In July, in fact, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick called for the cancellation of a book event. How do you understand this kind of reaction?
I expected it. This has been happening. And in fact, the back half of our book is taken up with a lot of events just like this. The weird coincidence for me, and the back half of the book was largely where I spent my time, was that the book tour became an event that we would have written about. And in the future, so we got tied up into the whole Alamo story. The basic from after World War I to the present, here's how the Alamo history goes. Historians say, "Oh, here I found something," and politicians say, "No, no, no, you didn't. Shut up." And because the state curriculum in Texas is controlled by politicians, they have been successful at enforcing the traditional Anglo narrative for school children. We take a full year of state history down here. It's a big dang deal. And what generations are taught, and then what they were allowed to for a long time teach at the University of Texas was enforced by politicians. So I was telling my co-authors, it's like, this book is going to come out and politicians are going to lose their minds. And my co-authors had never written a political book before. And they're like, "Oh no, there's going to be some controversy." And it's like, no. And sure enough, like, it started out with some state legislators calling for our book to be banned, and that was neat. And then Alan West, the former Texas State Republican chair, called us cancer culture cretins, and that was fine. But we had this one book event, in which what you're referring to, at the State History Museum. And they were real excited before our book came out to host an event for us. And it was all virtual. It was no big deal, but it was about 300 people signed up for it. At the time, it would have been our biggest event on the virtual book tour. A couple of days before that, some right-wing think tank started harassing the politicians, the governor, the House Speaker, and the Lieutenant Governor, the guy you're referring to get our event canceled, because they thought that it would be giving state sanction to our ideas and to approve of them, and using taxpayer dollars to promote our agenda. And keep in mind, this State History Museum also had no problem screening the movie Idiocracy by Mike Judge. There was no controversy about that. So take for that what you will. Right. But 3.5 hours before our event was supposed to take place, we got a call from the publisher saying that the museum had backed out because of social media pressure. And we smelled a rat, and we started filing open records requests, and we thought we might have to dig a little bit. But the very next day, the Lieutenant Governor tweeted out, "Oh no, I told them to cancel it. I didn't want this State History Museum to have any part of discussing this book about state history," which clearly would have been appropriate.
Man. Yeah, so the book comes at a time when there is great interest in correcting historical narratives to advance a more holistic American story. Are you hopeful by what you're seeing? I mean, and how are these efforts to reframe the past important to our future?
I think what happens in popular culture is so incredibly impactful. And I want to get to your first part of your question in a little bit, but let's take a look at Disney and John Wayne. I mean, the way Fess Parker was so impactful to a generation, to the baby boom generation, and how they understood Texas history, that there are people who know better but have such deep affection for the Fess Parker depiction of Davy Crockett that they just can't bring themselves to see it any different. Popular culture is, the best example I can think of is in Rambo, when Sylvester Stallone's character talks about coming home from Vietnam and being spat on, which didn't actually happen, but because people saw it in the movie, they think the soldiers came home from Vietnam and were spat on. It's less important what people are taught in school and more important what people see in popular culture. It's so impactful to how we understand our world. And it's these kinds of books and controversies that impact the popular culture and real conversations. And let me give you a good example of what I mean. It's one thing for it to make the news and we got great reviews and everyone kind of yawned. We were on Fresh Air, and the people who listened to Fresh Air listened to it. But it was only when the Lieutenant Governor says, no one should read this book, that people said, "Oh, well, I guess I better read this book." And then the craziest thing happened. People started having conversations about it, and that weren't mediated by media or by bookstores or by the usual gatekeepers, but they were just talking to their friends. I did this one book event for a Houston group, and you know how in Zoom, it was a Zoom thing, and you could see all the faces at the top. And it was this one boomer with like a little bit longer hair, and he kind of looked like the type who'd be upset about me saying Davy Crockett didn't go down swinging. And he didn't say anything through the whole thing. And then at the end, he like signaled that he wanted to ask a question. I said, "Oh, here it comes." Mm-hmm. He said, "Your book really made me mad." I'm like, "Yeah, I bet." And he said, "Because I learned that everything I was taught in school was a lie." Yeah, so I was a little relieved there.
Yeah.
He said, the great thing is that now I can have more honest conversations with my Hispanic friends, because I went to them and said, hey, did you know this? And they exploded as if they could finally talk to him unguarded about their relationship with Texas and what this meant to them. And the fact that friends, that Hispanics had been keeping this from their white friends for a long time, it really heartens me that people are going to have honest conversations about this, and that is going to change things. It's that our understanding of history isn't going to be mediated by politicians as much anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's an important book to read. It's an important lesson in history to understand that not everything is quite right. Not everything that we've learned has been taught to us in the proper way. And Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth might be a good place for folks to start. Jason Stanford, Austin-based writer and co-author with Brian Burrow and Chris Tomlinson of Forget the Alamo, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jason, really appreciate your time and look forward to having you back again soon.
I'd love that, Jim. Thank you so much. I enjoyed this.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Tim Mak, Washington investigative correspondent for NPR and author of Misfire, Inside the Downfall of the NRA.
The NRA has been one of the most powerful lobbying forces in this country. Is it still today?
It's still a tremendously powerful organization, but at the same time, it is going through one of the most serious crises it's ever faced in its history. I mean, you have a revolt by some of its members. You have a revolt by some of its board of directors. You have a financial crisis. Multiple congressional investigations have been done into the organization. And you have the New York Attorney General filing suit in court to try to dissolve the organization entirely because of what it said is tens of millions of dollars in inappropriate financial misconduct.
So is it losing members? Is it losing credibility?
Well, you know, the NRA has traditionally said that it has between 5 and 6 million members. At least that's what it was said in around 2019. When actually asked about it in a deposition for its bankruptcy trial, now remember the NRA tried to declare bankruptcy last year, Wayne Lapierre said that their membership was 4.9 million. So at the very highest, even if they use some funky methods of counting members, they're where they have been for the last 5 years or so. So definitely a lot of this reporting about the National Rifle Association's misconduct has affected their fundraising, has affected their membership.
Right. So what was the source of that? I was always curious, the source of the NRA power, because they really struck fear into the hearts of politicians, right? Is it because they had so many members? Is it because they gave away so much money? Is it because of the gun manufacturers? What was the strength of the NRA?
Money, obviously, is super helpful. But I think when you talk to lawmakers, what they're most worried about from the NRA is having their switchboards just light up with NRA members calling, getting yelled at a town hall, getting all sorts of letters and emails from NRA members opposing certain kinds of legislation. I think that's where the NRA's real power comes about, which is mobilizing their millions of members. That's something that is hard to replicate.
So they struck fear into the hearts of the politicians, and I guess the NRA got to its membership by striking fear in their hearts that their guns are going to be taken away, right? Hasn't it been that's their constant message?
Yeah, and it's a big theme of Misfire, this book that I've written, that the NRA does really, really well during the Obama years and kind of gets fat off of raising money during the Obama administration, saying that the Obama administration is a threat to your rights to own guns. And it's during that period that the National Rifle Association actually does a lot of spending and inappropriate misconduct. After Donald Trump is elected in 2016, which the NRA did a lot to ensure, there's a real cash crunch within the NRA. And that exposes some of the problems and financial wrongdoing that's happened over those years.
So when did it all start to fall apart?
It's a process that took some time, but I want to point to a period in around 2018, 2019. The NRA is struggling to pay even its own employees. It's in that much trouble. And the NRA had brought in someone you may be familiar with, Oliver North, to be the president of the NRA. And Oliver North comes in, and he's, of course, someone who's dedicated to the NRA's goals. But he didn't want to just be a figurehead. He wanted to try to fix some of these problems. And the more he investigated what was happening inside the NRA, the more he realized the rot was really very deep. He wanted to lead an internal audit of the NRA, and Wayne Lapierre and other folks inside the NRA just wouldn't let him. And this leads to this kind of climactic, very dramatic confrontation in an Indianapolis hotel suite in 2019, which I describe in the book.
You call it the weekend of hell, or from hell, right?
That's right. All of that comes about because in 2019, Oliver North is trying to get the NRA to be internally audited and figure out, hey, where are these millions of dollars coming and going? And Wayne Lapierre and other senior folks in the NRA are just refusing to let that happen. And so Wayne Lapierre actually wins out in the end and gets Oliver North pushed out of the presidency of the NRA.
Right. So the rest of the NRA board, did they know what was going on? Did they know about the financial irregularities and just look the other way?
I think the book shows that the NRA board was not particularly interested in knowing or finding out. That the NRA board is made up of a lot of members put there by Wayne Lapierre, and who benefit a lot personally and monetarily from being on the board. And it's also a very important part of their personality that they're members of the NRA board. And so they've not done a very good job of overseeing the group's finances. I mean, if you look at some of the folks on the NRA board, very, very, very few of them, and there are 76 members on the board, have any sort of personal background, any sort of resume that would lead you to think that they could oversee the National Rifle Association, which brings in hundreds of millions of dollars every year.
Right. Now, you've mentioned Wayne Lapierre a few times, and of course you can't talk about the NRA without talking about him. You know, I debated him several times on Crossfire. I was never that impressed with him, but he certainly, for a while at least, did a good job leading and building that organization. The picture you paint of Wayne Lapierre is not the picture that we see of the public Wayne Lapierre that we think of, right, or we normally see. You paint a picture of him as being fairly weak, can't make up his mind, afraid of confrontation.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to folks who know Wayne Lapierre personally, what you see is a man who is deeply, deeply anxious and unsure and afraid to get into sort of any argument with anyone. The book kind of opens with this scene, and we're at Wayne Lapierre's wedding in the late 90s.
I know, this is an incredible scene. I wanted to ask you about it, so go ahead. This is unbelievable.
So it's Wayne's wedding day, and he doesn't want to get married. He doesn't show up on time for the wedding. Everyone is there at the wedding waiting for him. All the major characters of the NRA's future and past are at this wedding, and he just does not want to get married. And his best man goes to him and says, I've got $100 on the dashboard of my car. Let's get out of here. Wayne somehow, despite not wanting to get married, gets talked into it by his bride, Susan Lapierre, ultimately Susan Lapierre. And he spends the ceremony looking awkwardly everywhere but at his bride. It is just an awkward and weird event. Now, the point of telling the story is to kind of show how Wayne, over the last few decades, has very little will to carry out a strategy that the NRA's history of the last, since the 90s, while led by Wayne, has been one in which Wayne can be cowed into doing pretty much anything if people yell at him long enough and demand things strenuously enough. That's the nature of Wayne as a person.
And tell us about the financial irregularities, or I mean, let's just Wayne Lapierre was a big spender, right? He and his Susan lived a very highfalutin lifestyle, all paid for by the NRA. You go into a lot of details in the book. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, so Wayne is someone who historically has not cared about the finer things in life. You know, when he was a lobbyist for the NRA in the 80s, he was just this kind of disheveled egghead type, you know, someone who's kind of more professorial, doesn't really care about his clothes, doesn't really care about fine dining, that sort of thing. But after he marries Susan, things really change. And, you know, Susan Lapierre is an interesting character in the book as well, because there's very little, I don't think there's much written at all about her in the past, but she's kind of a hidden hand in the National Rifle Association, where Wayne is weak-willed. Susan Lapierre has a very, very strong personality. And that's something that I examine in the book. You know, Wayne Lapierre doesn't use email. So the only folks who are using what's ostensibly Wayne's personal email are Susan, his wife, and his personal assistant. Susan Lapierre ends up having a tremendous amount of influence over the organization.
Right. And as I say, and they were spending big time, private jets, very fancy vacations, right, to exotic spots, all paid for by the NRA.
We're talking trips to the Bahamas, trips to Europe, Lake Como. We're talking private jets in the millions of dollars, lavish meals, six figures in suits for Wayne. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And ultimately, the New York Attorney General's investigation into the NRA finds that over just this period of a few short years, Wayne and a number of the defendants the New York Attorney General named have misspent tens of millions of dollars in NRA funds. And these are this is money largely raised by its grassroots, right? Folks who are members of the NRA, and a lot of them are blue-collar folks who are putting $5, $10, $15 towards the NRA, hoping that it will kind of benefit a cause they believe in. But it's all a lot of it's going to, you know, all of this misconduct that we've been describing here.
But you also mentioned a lot of it was going to pretty inflated salaries among the top staffers at the NRA.
Yeah, there are kind of two tiers of staff at the NRA. You know, the NRA is, when you look at it from the outside, it's this nonprofit, right? And so a lot of folks end up working for the NRA for very low dollar wages, rationalizing that, hey, I want to work for a cause I really believe in. I'm willing to take a pay cut to do so. So many of the employees of the NRA are paid pretty low wages compared to what their job description is. But the other tier of the NRA is the folks who make it to the very top, the executives, people like Wayne Lapierre, people like, you know, folks who end up on the board and benefit from being on the board of directors of the NRA. There's this two-tier system, one in which folks are treated really poorly and one in which people are treated very lavishly.
You say something in the book that I was surprised to read. I have always felt that particularly lately, that the NRA, the strength of the NRA and most of their resources came from the gun manufacturers, that they really represent more the gun manufacturers than hunters and sportsmen. But you indicate that's not true, that it's still the heart of the organization are the, you know, gun owners who, hunters, sportsmen, people like target practice, and those people.
Well, I think it's true to say that the heart of the NRA's power comes from its ability to mobilize its members. I'm not saying that the support of the gun industry has no effect whatsoever. It certainly has some effect when it comes to money, but from the core of it, the NRA's power really does come from its ability to mobilize millions and millions of people.
Okay, so the message of the NRA, particularly under Wayne Lapierre, has been the Second Amendment is absolute, period, end of story. The one big test with that, which you write a lot about, is, of course, Sandy Hook, where this unbelievable massacre of 20 first graders and 6 adults at Sandy Hook. And that was a real time of crisis for the NRA. How did Wayne Lapierre respond?
Well, there's always been this internal division in the NRA between, its lobbyists and the folks who need to go on Capitol Hill and explain the NRA's policy, and the folks who are fundraising for the NRA, as well as those who are in charge of increasing membership. Now, the people who want to fundraise and increase membership, they're more interested in more radical messaging, things that will really get the base riled up. The lobbyists are a little less interested in that. They need to go face lawmakers and try to explain the NRA's position. After Sandy Hook happens, you see that the NRA really doubles down on culture war rhetoric and focusing only on Republican politicians and not at all on moderate Democrats, as they had previously done in prior decades. You'll remember after Sandy Hook that the NRA actually suggested more guns in schools after that shooting, and that was their kind of messaging. It marked a real turn for the organization.
They really doubled down at that time, right? More guns,
that's
armed
right.
guards in
Sandy Hook
schools.
is a real turning point for the National Rifle Association and what direction they're going to take in the decade to come.
So is Wayne Lapierre still in charge today?
The question is, to what extent has Wayne Lapierre been in charge all along? I think that's a fair question. Or to what extent is he being manipulated by powerful people inside the NRA who are benefiting greatly, benefiting to the tune of millions of dollars from him? He's still at the head. He's still the CEO and executive vice president, despite all of the problems that I've described, from financial to legal. And what's interesting about it is we've been able to paint for the first time with Misfire this portrait of his personality and what's actually happening behind the curtain, inside this black box that is the NRA. This process took several years. I mean, we did over 120 interviews and obtained by various ways hundreds of pages of secret depositions and NRA emails and inside documents in order to draw this picture.
Bill Press with Tim Mak, Washington investigative correspondent for NPR and author of Misfire, Inside the Downfall of the NRA. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Stephen Hill, Jason Stanford, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.